Good morning and welcome back to our fall Bible study, Believe in Me, Jesus, in the Gospel of John. And today we are in the second half of the book of John. Finally, we're in chapters 12 and 13 for Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem and Jesus' washing of the disciples' feet. So before we start that, let's review our previous lesson. It's been an extra week, so we have to, dig back in our memories to 2 weeks ago. Of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So what stood out to you? What did we learn out of that lesson?
Some people started believing in Jesus because he was able, and then of course the Jewish leaders were out to get him.
Okay, so the repercussions of the raising of Lazarus really, there were multiple and far-reaching, right? So the belief in Jesus has just kind of, exploded out of this event, right? It really changed the way that, we read it, and if we line up all the references to like Lazarus and the miracle there, we really see a big effect on people's belief in Jesus. This was a testimony of works that made a lot of people decide to believe in Jesus. And then it also caused the authorities to really codify their opposition to Jesus, to actually make plans to kill him. They're not just picking up a stone to maybe stone him. I think we'll stone you. That's blasphemy. No, now they're making a plan. Now they have made a decision as a group, and they are going to put Jesus to death. And so we talked about Jesus' path to the cross, coming out of this Lazarus miracle. Yeah, what else?
Well, he did show his love for Lazarus and his sisters. Maybe didn't do it exactly the way they wanted or on the timeline that they wanted, because he had a greater plan of how this would all unfold. But he did go back to them, and he did what they asked.
Yeah. So, we talked about that line, Jesus loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha, so he remained where he was. And it's puzzling. It's a puzzling word choice, but it's not until we put the repercussions in, we understand those repercussions, that we see that Jesus' love for them was a love that was built on God's plan for salvation, right? It was a love for them personally, and it was a love for humanity and for each other person personally that would cause Jesus to take this path that will put him sort of point of no return, is our kind of literary device here, where he's now on the road to the cross. Yeah. What else? We saw Martha give a great confession. We hear about Peter's great confession, but Martha has a great confession here. She proclaims Jesus' identity in the words of a faithful disciple. And we saw the discipleship of Mary and Martha here. The idea that they were deep in grief and they were faithful to Jesus and in their devotion to him and their belief in him, their trust in him, all the way through that is, the sort of the fuel behind that great confession. Yeah. And we talked about sort of a progression of Jesus dealing with and putting it in the terms of the effects of sin in our lives and how it damages us and how Jesus can heal. And we saw this run all the way through these past 3 lessons, right? The man at the pool of Bethesda, and then the man born blind, who neither he nor he was told, stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. We know that sometimes the things in our lives that go wrong are because of our sin or others directly. But then with the man born blind, it was not directly. It was just the corrosion of sin and death in the world. And Jesus was addressing that And then he doesn't fully address it until Lazarus's tomb, where he becomes angry at we sort of speculated a little bit that he must be angry at the power of grief and sorrow that sin causes. And that is also, I think, part of his determination to go to the cross and deal with, sin and death, have victory over them once for all. Yeah. Anything else from last week?
I always think it's funny, it's not in the Bible at all, but why was Lazarus, if he was such a good friend of Jesus, why was he not a disciple? And, because we don't hear a lot about Jesus' friends other than the disciples, except for this group. And I think, and after all of this, how was Lazarus in the church later on? Did he become a great leader and spokesperson for Jesus?
And there is quite a bit of speculation about that out in the world, as you might imagine. One, it seems that Martha is the head of this household with Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And so there is some, and it is really pure speculation, but that maybe Lazarus has a disability. Maybe he is in some way not capable. And so, and maybe that's why we don't hear about him as a leader in the church going forward. Or maybe he has, long-term illness. We just don't know. Or maybe this is just a case of we just don't have the whole story. The Gospels are curated and we don't get to hear about everybody we want to hear about. And, I would love to hear more about Lazarus and what happened next. We don't hear that. And hence that speculation.
Yet his story persists, as one of the most prominent.
The raising of Lazarus.
The raising of the dead. You hear that even out in the world. You hear
the expression.
The expression.
Yes.
Coming from this story used.
Yeah.
About Lazarus raising the dead.
Right. For
other things that kind of.
I don't know how
happenings.
I can't think exactly how it's used, but it is used for someone to do a Lazarus. Come back from dead, although this is dead all the way, like not dead, but actually dead. Yeah.
For other, situations that were hopeless situations.
Yes.
Come out of it unexpectedly.
Yeah. So definitely, like, the story persists, yet we don't know, like, what kind of person was Lazarus? What happened to Lazarus next? Yeah. Go ahead, Chair.
So something that Pam said struck a memory of a thought that I had this morning when I was reading this with Judas. She said Lazarus was not a disciple. Why was Judas a disciple?
Well,
and I might be getting ahead of us,
Well, so, okay, maybe we don't want to say Lazarus was not a disciple, right? He's not presented in an active way.
Not one of the 12.
Not one of the 12, and neither were Mary and Martha, and yet they are presented as disciples, as are, whole Samaritan village and the woman at the well and, all these other people in between, right? But maybe Lazarus is, and we just don't see it, he's busy. He's all covered in grave cloths and he's not up to doing anything quite yet,
He's just come back from the dead. He's got some time to recuperate.
Right. So at least clean up, So we don't know. And maybe he is a disciple in the way of these people who are not traveling with Jesus and yet are faithful disciples.
This episode is in The Chosen that I watched.
Oh, the show,
and
The Chosen.
They interpreted Lazarus as very rich and very succulent home, and a place where Jesus could come and just relax, and they could discuss a lot of things because they all felt comfortable talking and sharing with him. But I was struck by the fact that they pictured Lazarus as a very wealthy, prominent person in his town.
Interesting.
Yeah, like where did they get that information from?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Well,
Where-
that is just as speculative as that Lazarus had maybe a developmental disability. Completely pure speculation. And yet, just the idea, like, it's helpful for us to go like, hey, these were real people with real lives. I wonder what they were like and how does this affect them, not in, a cartoon version, but in a real.
I found it very interesting, in the episode they showed, how comfortable Jesus was, and this was
Yeah.
just,
Well, and
just in their home, but Jesus noticed Lazarus kind of, he was hiding from everyone, he wasn't feeling too well, and so Jesus came.
they had to insert some foreshadowing in there, huh, in their show.
So how they did that was
I-
interesting, but.
One piece, it does seem like they have quite a prominent household in that they host Jesus, can host Jesus for a dinner, host Jesus overnight at Bethany during Passion Week is how the synoptics, what's that?
And his disciples.
It looks like it from the way that the synoptics are written, yeah.
The presence of the expensive perfume.
Okay.
Is another.
Is embedded in today's lesson. So let's go there. Very good. Yeah, great points all around. Let's do a brief note from the end of chapter 11, okay? Because at the end of chapter 11, they have decided the authorities have decided to kill Jesus, right? Well, Jesus withdraws to the wilderness near a city called Ephraim and stays with his disciples there. And when it says there he stayed with the disciples, it may mean he had extra disciples in Ephraim, right? Not just the 12, but there were people there who were very loyal to him. And so later, those people go to the feast. You see in verse 54, Jesus went away there to the country near the wilderness. And in 55, many went up to Jerusalem out of the country before the Passover. And so some of these crowds that are in Jerusalem, like we know all the Jews would be coming into Jerusalem, right, for Passover. And some of these crowds are crowds that are loyal to Jesus. And some of those may have come out of the country near Ephraim. And so at the beginning of chapter 12, Jesus returns to Bethany where he is given a dinner. Notice it says they made him a supper there, right? And this is a way of saying that Jesus is the guest of honor. They made a supper for him. They hosted a dinner in Jesus' honor, and Mary anoints Jesus with this costly perfume. And so when we read this in order, we see like the dinner is probably a celebration of Lazarus' new life, right? And the anointing, the perfume, all of it are out of gratitude and joy for the raising of Lazarus. But then we get this note, Jesus also foreshadowing, right, that this is in preparation for his burial. So we have shifted into the latter half, like we're into the passion now, like it has, the progression has begun. Jesus has been anointed for his eventual burial. In 12:9-11, we see a large crowd of the Jews had spilled over from Jerusalem. See, he's still in Bethany in 9-11. And this large crowd of the Jews is probably, those that were there when Lazarus was raised. They've come back for the supper to see what's going on. And because of the stir, look at verse 10 and 11. What are they doing? What else are the chief priests and the authorities doing, the Jewish authorities doing?
They want to kill Lazarus too.
They want to kill Lazarus too, right? They are also planning to put Lazarus to death. He's just too powerful of a testimony, and it doesn't fit in their plans. And so they are going to put him to death as well. Would someone please read verses 12-19?
The next day, the great crowd that had come for the feast heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel." Jesus found a young donkey and sat upon it, as it is written, "Do not be afraid, O daughter of Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt." At first his disciples did not understand all of this. Only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him and that they had done these things to him. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had given this miraculous sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him."
Thank you. Thank you. It's a little bit, yeah. Not funny, not ha-ha funny, but a little funny. Okay, the crowd finds out that Jesus is coming from Bethany to Jerusalem, and they prepare an entry for him. What is this entry like?
Seems what you do for a king.
What you do for a king. How so?
Kings rode on donkeys.
Okay, the riding on this young donkey colt, it's a fulfillment of this prophecy from Zechariah. It's how David had Solomon come into the city when he was saying, "Solomon is my heir." Solomon is the heir to David, not all of these other people. Remember, there was if you go back to those stories and kind of dredge it up in your memory, there was a lot of unrest over David's succession, right? Absalom wanted it. Like multiple people want the kingship after David. And David says, no, it's Solomon. And he puts him on the king's mule to ride into the city. So there's a mark of succession, like the successor of David there. Yeah, what else?
Just the lining the streets and the palm branches.
Okay, palm branches, right? John is the only gospel that mentions palm, and it's how we get the traditions of Palm Sunday. And palm branches were used in the Maccabean victory processions, just briefly before the New Testament period. The Jews had a period of victory where they were able to reclaim the temple, reconsecrate it after it had been desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes, and those processions incorporated palm branches, and those are mentioned in First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. And so, I have those passages if you want to read about that. But palm branches would have indicated these messianic hopes, these hopes for victory against the occupying oppressor, the hopes for a new king, a new leader. And so they're echoing that. And then they also have singing, right? What are they singing? Hosanna, right. This is a word that's Aramaic for save now. It's used as a cry for help and also for praise to the God who does save now. And the singing would have come from the Psalms, because the Hallel, Psalm 113 to 118, were traditional Psalms for Passover. And some of these were sung in procession, normally sung, but here they're making them about Jesus, right? They're not just singing like we always sing. Now we're singing that Jesus is the fulfillment of our hopes, right? So, and the procession is very much like a king would have when he returned victorious from battle, right? He's coming back to the city, so people go out to him and parade into the city together, so that a king returns with a victory procession with all of those people. And it has that air here. And this is the opening of the narrative that paints Jesus as king in the passion portion of John. So as we go forward and to the action at the end of the book, Jesus as king is like a primary sort of image, and it begins here. Yeah. Other questions or comments on this section?
he's been keeping things kind of quiet up until this point. So
Okay.
this is like the big explosion. It's just the antithesis, the whole of it. Everything's been building to this
Right.
point, and,
He's been slipping away.
Right.
He's been hiding himself. But here, this is public. This is
loud, and this is
Yes.
joyous, and
Yeah.
this
And-
exaltation.
And what's the instigation for this to become loud, right? A lot of people are pretty hyped on Jesus. Why did they become to believe in Jesus? Verses 17 through 19. Lazarus. Yeah. The miracle, the word is spreading. The people who knew about it are testifying. I would think maybe those crowds from Ephraim who are loyal to Jesus are there. And so the people who are excited about Jesus, who believe in Jesus, who trust him, are spreading the word. And this triumphal entry is part of that repercussion of Lazarus's raising. Yeah.
I'm struck by the coincidence, although it's God-led, not really coincidence. This is a time when Jerusalem is just flooded and crowded with lots of people even camping outside the city and not a lot to do and a lot of time to talk to people from all kinds of different places. And word of Lazarus is raising, probably just spread like wildfire.
Yeah.
And then they sit and say, what do you think this means?
Right.
And a lot of time and that's not really a coincidence to have one happen right after the other. This was a perfect time to spread the word about Jesus, just as far wide as you could. Yeah.
A perfect time for the word about Jesus to spread, and part of in a good way, in a way of people believing him, but also in a way that will lead to the violence, because these messianic uprisings were a sort of a repeated, like an ongoing thing that would happen in this period. And so the fact that this eventually leads to violence is also not unexpected from out of this. Yeah. So, the chief priests say, we are not doing any good. I loved that. My translation, no, mine is, we're not doing any good. What is yours? What was it? It was good.
Yeah, this is getting us nowhere.
This is getting us nowhere, right? Because why? What's the problem? The whole world has gone after him, right? And there's a sense of dramatic irony here, right? Because they're giving this as a problem statement, right? Bad. The whole world has gone. And yet, this is the mission of John's book, to share so the whole world can know and go after Jesus. And it's the very purpose of the testimony that's written. So here we have this double meaning of the problem statement and the mission statement here in that last verse. Let's read 20 through 26.
Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. Sir, they said, we would like to see Jesus. Philip went to tell Andrew. Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Jesus replied, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me.
Nice, thank you. Okay, so what's the connection between verse 19 and verse 20? We get the whole world has gone after him, and then what? Some Greeks.
Gentiles.
Right, Gentiles, exactly. What we have is a beginning of what will eventually be actually, the Jewish leaders were speaking in hyperbole, right? by the whole world, they meant everyone in Jerusalem right now, right? But John truly does mean the whole world. And here is a beginning. These Greeks come and they want to see Jesus. And I'm really, this is one of those things that I'm really bummed that we do not get to see the outcome. Like, we don't get to see the conversation. Did they get to see Jesus? Did he take the meeting? Did he not take the meeting? Like, we don't actually know. Instead, John doesn't tell us that. I wish he did. And instead, Jesus teaches. What is Jesus saying in verse 23?
Basically saying he's going to have to die in order for his word about him to spread.
Right. He's going to have to die, right? He says the hour has come. What is the hour? The hour for what?
Yeah.
His death. He first says to be glorified, by which he means his crucifixion. And we can tell because he's talking about the grain of wheat falling to the ground and dying. And this is a reference to Jesus and his death. And it may be that Jesus is part of what he's meaning. This is just a maybe, that it's not time for him to meet with the Greeks yet, because until he is glorified, until the cross, until his death and resurrection, this message is not yet for the whole world. He has work to do until it's for the whole world. I'm not sure. It's one way to read it. What does verse 25 mean? And really, yeah, 25 and 26. Like, we've gone from 24, where the grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies. If it dies, it bears much fruit. And we can apply that to Jesus. Then what?
The next two verses are about us, about the people.
Okay, about us, right? We have, so this is a pattern, right? Jesus talks about his death. The talk then turns to discipleship, right? Our response to Jesus' work, right? Jesus does what he needs to do, and then we follow, right? Followers of Jesus should expect the same outcome as Jesus, right? Anyone who loves his life will what? Lose it. Yeah. There is a sense of being willing to give up our lives as Jesus did, follow Jesus into suffering and death, into self-giving love and
I have
sacrifice.
a question about the
Yeah.
glorification. It seems like we talk about that being his death. I always thought that was more about his resurrection, because we all die, and if he had just died, then he wouldn't have been glorified.
Mm-hmm. So, the short answer is it's both, right? but I think, yeah. So John really focuses on the cross as his glorification. You see that in this passage. It's really clear that, like, the hour to be glorified is really about death and the resurrection. So we can think of it as a seed that falls to the ground and dies. Already within that seed is everything it needs for new life, right? That seed contains the new tree, right? And so Jesus' death already contains his resurrection, his ascension, his being seated at the right hand of God. And I think that's how John must think of it, as the cross is that moment that encapsulates everything. And that idea of, like, well, we all die. Well, we have all sinned and we all die. Jesus did not sin. And we wonder, what would the end of his earthly life have been without the sacrifice that he gave? And that's a question for a theological discussion, right? But the idea of his death as a sacrifice, as a point of self-giving love, is, like, I think, the idea of glorified. Because when we talk about glory, we're talking about something that reveals the truth about God. And the truth about God is shining and great. And so a lot of times when we talk about glory, we think about the lighting up part of glory, right? But at the core of what glory is, it's something that reveals the truth about God and the sacrifice that God is willing to make is the core of God's character. That self-giving love is God's nature in a way that we never would have guessed, right? That glorification is how, and I think that's why John talks about it as the cross. It is a little, yeah. It's slightly different than the other gospels. It's slightly different than the way we sometimes think about it. Yeah, as John likes to do. Other questions? Well, so Jesus in 27 through 50, Jesus is troubled about the ordeal to come, and we hear the voice of God the Father. And it's a scene that reminds us maybe of the baptism of Jesus in the synoptics. And Jesus, this here in John, it is turned towards the cross. If I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself in verse 32. And there's a fascinating little thing that we don't have time to get into about how John tells us that the people who do not believe are just like the people who wouldn't believe Isaiah, right? They're just like those people before the exile who refused to repent and therefore they ended up in exile. And John tells us that when Isaiah saw his vision of the throne room of God, with the smoke and the train of the Lord filling the temple, and the seraphim and the cherubims crying out, "Holy, holy, holy," that he was also seeing the glory of God the Son. He saw Jesus' glory, John specifies. So very interesting little passage there. Jesus concludes all of that by saying, the things I speak just as the Father has told me. And we are entering into a section of John where there is a lot of speaking. What things does Jesus speak? The things we're about to hear. So we get the scene in chapter 13, and then we get a lot of teaching of John. Would someone read John 13, 1 through 4?
It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist.
Thank you. Okay, so these 4 verses here provide an introduction and summary for the rest of the chapter. So this is our little intro, right? Verse 1, when is it?
Before Passover.
It's before Passover. Now your NIV and your NLT will add just before, but literally it just says now before. And so the meal that we're about to witness, a lot of scholars believe is not the same meal at which the Lord's Supper was instituted, but is a meal before that. The way that it's written is a little hard to figure out the timing. I think it's not written with the intent to display. It's not about the timing, and so it's hard to sort of like match everything up. But it is a meal that seems to be maybe the same upper room that they were allowed to use in Jerusalem. They seem to have a private place. It seems to be a place where they don't have another host, right? And so they don't have Any other servants? There's no servants there because there's no other host there. They're in their own space. Okay, so let's read 5 through 17. Would somebody read that?
After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then, Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. And Jesus answered, a person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. How far?
17.
When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. I am not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill the scripture. He who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me. I'm telling you that now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. I tell you the truth, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's back to verse 5.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening here?
Jesus is humbling himself.
Okay.
In a servant's position.
A servant's position, yeah.
And doing it out of love for his apostles.
Yeah, out of love. So they would have come into probably this upper room. There don't seem to be servants here. There seems to be a private time with the disciples. And they must have not had their feet washed. And, we can imagine that they would just come in, and so they're just naturally grimy. And at formal Roman dinners, people would recline at a low table, and the physician put your feet close to the other diners. And that sort of reclining style was optional for some Jewish meals, but required for Passover meals. And it seems that they are reclining at the table here. It mentions it in verse 12 and verse 23. So their dirty feet are like, in other people's faces, right? It's not a practically speaking, it's not a desirable condition, right? And foot washing is a normal part of life, would normally be done. It just would normally be done by a servant, right? The followers of a rabbi might wash the rabbi's feet. That would be normal, right? So why do you suppose that none of the disciples picks up the job?
It's not their job. It's a servant's job.
Not my job. It's a servant's job. I can't remember what job I had where the words "not my job" were forbidden. And maybe it was more than one. I can't remember when that started, but if I ever it comes out of my mouth, "That's not my job," I'm like, no, that's a no-no, right? But it wasn't their job. It's a lowly job. It's a servant's job, right? What are the disciples doing these days? John doesn't tell us. The synoptics tell us. They're busy having arguments about who's the greatest, right?
Yeah.
I think they were too busy trying to promote their own status and position to consider, like, hey, this job, like, maybe I'm the least in the room. Lee.
And it comes right after his triumphal entry. So they were probably feeling kind of like, we're on the right side. We're like these cool guys because we're on this team, this winning team.
Yeah.
We're special.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that like he felt like this was the moment to be kind of like, I need to be an example to them of how they're going to need to adopt a certain mindset.
Okay, so my next question was, why do you think Jesus takes up the job? And so one of those answers is an example, right? What else? Why else does Jesus take up this job?
Maybe he's trying to humble them, because if they're thinking about what position they're in, who's the best and all that, maybe he's trying to take them down a notch.
I wrote that as maybe as an antidote to the misplaced concern for greatness that he sees among them. Yeah, that this is a pattern that is not a good pattern, right? And we see, in Luke, just as soon as Jesus says one of you will betray me, they start having an argument about who's the greatest, right? Because, and I think I hadn't thought about them just coming off the high of the triumphal entry, but I think it's a great point, And also, I think Jesus takes up this job simply because it needs to be done.
And it's a very intimate job. I mean, when you think about it, someone washing your dirty feet is, I don't know, just touching someone's feet that is not a family member or, that you're really close to. It just seems like an unusual thing to do.
Yeah.
I know it's part of the custom there, but at the same time, I just think that maybe isn't also a means of drawing them closer to him, because he talks about, unless I do this for you, you're not part of me. So it was maybe a way to draw them in.
Draw them in.
And at this point, he knows he's going to die.
Yeah.
And we've heard stories of people knowing they're near death, and they want to do something for their loved ones. They want to give some of themselves. This may be just a way he is grieving.
I think that's really interesting. We talked about him being anointed by Mary in preparation for his burial, but his service in preparation for his death might be an additional way to think about that. Yeah, I think so. I think, it's worth considering that always the foot washing thing would have been like a daily, a regular thing. And so does it become, I don't know, I have mixed feelings just trying to imagine it. Is it super intimate when a servant does it for you all the time, or is it more normal, or can it be both?
It would be normal for them to do it, but for him to do it,
Yes.
It takes on a different,
which is why Peter
feeling to it.
Resists. Yeah. What do you think of Peter's resistance? Typical Peter, like, no, yes. Yeah.
Just wash my whole body then.
Right.
Not just my
Yeah.
feet.
I wonder if Peter wasn't like, oh gosh, I should have done that.
Yeah.
Or, oh, so-and-so, who's clearly the least among us, should have done that. I'm mad at him for not doing it. Now Jesus has to do it. It has the, do you ever see like where the older sibling is like, well, the younger sibling really ought to be doing that,
You've never seen that, right?
Oh, no, never. But it's kind of the vibe here, Peter may have felt he should have picked up the towel. He may have felt that, Levi, he's the tax collector. He ought to have picked up the towel. Or John, he's the youngest. He ought to have picked up the towel. Like, why is Jesus doing it? You guys, don't let him do that. You should get there and do that yourself. But, right. I don't know.
He just frequently just missed the point,
Yes,
Well,
yes.
he did that.
So he did miss the point. And Jesus says, you don't understand. And he says, you won't fully understand until later. But he explains it for later now, right? What is Jesus' explanation and instruction? Maybe starting in verse 14.
He wants them to wash each other's feet later.
Yeah. So is that, so literally, and are we to literally wash one another's feet? I mean, Jesus, I mean, it's right there in the Bible. You ought to wash one another's feet.
And there are groups of churches who have historically incorporated that into worship service, foot washing. Yes, and so that is.
I went to a
taking it
youth
very
retreat that
very
incorporated
literally.
it. I'm still bitter.
Yeah,
Same.
so very literally.
There was, and my sweet mate was like so thick about feet. And they had, like, she washed my feet, and I remember thinking, like, I mean, it was awkward, because I knew for her in particular, it was like, and I don't think my feet are particularly horrifying, but I mean, she had like a real, like, issue. I knew from living with her, like, that was like an issue for her, but she did that, so.
Yeah. Well, I this was so many years ago, but I did it and it was fine. But the person whose feet I washed was so deeply embarrassed that I ended up feeling like the whole thing was extremely manipulative. I was not happy with it. And when I look back on it, I do not have good feelings about it, So what are we supposed to do?
Well, I think that
Go ahead,
I
Sharon,
think
and then
it's
Mary.
about caring for each other. Like, I have to cut Glenn's toenails, so I think that should count.
I think it should.
Cleaning his feet. I know there are others who have to help their mates out too.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's what he's getting at.
Okay. So
take care of each other.
Yeah. Okay. And Mary, what were you going to say?
Same thing, our service to each other and
Yeah.
to not be, I don't know, maybe not think it's someone else's job to do that, that humble ourselves to do it.
Yeah. So just, there's so many equivalents to foot washing today that what's that?
Not feel like we're humbling ourselves.
Yeah, right. Like, oh, I'm so great, and yet I'm doing this lowly thing, right? That's not the vibe. I don't think Jesus had that attitude, right? And we say, oh, but Jesus would deserve to, but the whole point of who Jesus is that he didn't have the attitude of I'm so great, and I'm lowering myself. So we aren't set up of the way that we walk. I mean, I wear sandals in the summer, and I do find that sometimes I'm like, I can't walk on that. That's a dirt path. I got to go walk over here so I can stay on the sidewalk. My sandals will get too dirty. But most of the time, we do not need our feet washed. We do need a lot of other things. Sometimes, hygiene help, or, I think of the person who's scraping the food trays at the front of the cafeteria. Now that is a lowly job, right? I mean, any janitorial service, other people leave a mess. I think a couple of our ladies came into the campus center kitchen on Sunday morning and discovered it full of dirty dishes that were left there by parties unknown, and washed them all up so that we could have a clean kitchen to host our college students. That's it. That's anything that you see and like, no, it's not my job. Yes, it usually should be done by somebody else. It's undesirable to do, but it needs done. So we do it, right? And that is the service, I think. I think that's so much more important than literal foot washing, right? Maybe it has a place at youth retreats. I don't know. Lee.
I was just, when we first started with this, I was struck by verse 3 where it says, like, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe. So it's it's kind of strange, like he's realizing that he, or not realizing that he's the son of God and therefore I need to do this thing. Like it's very strongly linked between him being God and needing to do this thing.
Yes, yes. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Right? Somehow, okay. Somehow being God makes it not less likely that he shows his love in lowly service, but it defines that he shows his love in lowly service. Isn't that interesting? We're going to get out of order, and then, wow, it's just, how will we ever get back? But this is so super interesting because this is the nature of Jesus, is it not? Jesus doesn't, like, this is the truth about God. One of the foundational truths about God is God never goes against God's nature. God is only who God is, and always, right? There are no two faces, no two-faced behavior, right? No masks on God. God is only who God is. And so this must be Jesus' nature. Isn't that kind of a remarkable thing? This isn't a departure from Jesus' nature, but it's actually his nature. Well, let's read, and you're tying together those two verses, I think, Lee. I hadn't really put that together, and I think that shows up very well. Let's look at 18 through 32, the end of this passage.
And Linda read some of this already, right?
What's that?
No, I stopped at 17.
No, yeah, I think, right?
Oh, she's not
19.
19.
I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so let's pick up at 21. Or yes, you went through 20. When Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me." And the disciples began looking at one another, at a loss to know of which one he was speaking. And there was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. So Simon Peter gestured to him and said to him, "Tell us who it is of whom he's speaking." And so Peter is actually talking to, the him that Peter's talking to is the disciple whom Jesus loved. So let's just call him John for our handiness, right? So Peter says to John, ask him who it is, right? That's how that reads. Verse 25. John, he, leaning back thus on Jesus' bosom, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus then answered, "That is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him." So when he had dipped the morsel, he took it and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan entered into him, and therefore Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." Now no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose Jesus had said this to Judas. For some were supposing, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus was saying him, "Go buy the things we have need of for the feast." So see, there's the disciples are still expecting another feast. Or else that he should give something to the poor, quickly, apparently. So after receiving the morsel, Judas went out immediately, and it was night. You'll notice that just like the introduction in verses 1 through 4, as soon as Jesus begins to serve the disciples, begins to talk about his death, he turns to the subject of betrayal. Verse 18, what does Jesus say will happen?
To fulfill scripture.
Yeah.
Sure.
To fulfill scripture what?
To fulfill the scripture that he who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me.
Okay, the person who eats with me will betray me, will act against me, right? What is Jesus talking about?
talking about Judas.
Okay, verse 21, one of you will betray me. He takes the bread, he gives it to Judas in verse 26 and 27. Satan enters into Judas. So I think he is definitely talking about Judas. Go ahead, what were you going to say?
So Judas doesn't necessarily know he's going to do that. Does he? Does he not? I mean, I read somewhere where he took liberties with the coins that he collected and he would take them out.
Yes.
You know,
He was
yes.
a thief.
he wasn't quite
It talks about that,
honest.
yes.
He was somewhat dishonest.
Yeah, there's some problems.
So
Judas
why-
had some
so-
heart problems
So my question
going
is,
in. Yeah.
Why? Well, I see it, but why was he a disciple?
Why bother following Jesus if you're going to,
Why was he chosen?
why was
Didn't
it?
Jesus choose his disciple or maybe I'm confusing the two.
Okay. The question is, why would Jesus choose him if he was going to be a betrayer?
And-
Why is he sticking with Jesus if he wants to betray Jesus? Notice the way this, I say, like, he who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me. I do think that's about Judas. But isn't it about more?
Yeah, I think it's about all of us. If
Okay.
we are not followers and we are not believers, then we lift up our heel.
Yes, and if we are believers, then we're the ones eating Jesus' bread. And yet sometimes, yes, we lift up our heel against him. It is just the case that every one of us is a betrayer, and yet here we are following Jesus, right? And so that idea that that betrayals will happen is part of discipleship. It's part of what sends Jesus to the cross, and it's part of our life together, right? We ourselves experience it from the other side. The person who eats my bread has lifted his heel up against me. We have all been acted against, betrayed, been hurt. We have all been hurt by a friend. And Jesus turns to that very thing, right? A slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent, this is the word from which we get apostle, one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. And so who is sent to tell about Jesus? All of us, and all of us experience this turmoil, this struggle. It's the very struggle that Jesus has to conquer sin and death for, right? Why is Jesus telling them ahead of time in verse 19?
Well, is he preparing them for what's to come?
Okay, preparing them. Jesus has known. They need to know. What else?
So that you will believe that
Strengthens their belief. How so?
Because he's been telling them all these things that are going to happen and why they're happening.
Okay. So there's some sense of, if I tell you something is going to happen and then it does happen, you see that I've been telling you the truth, right? That prophetic sort of prediction is validating, it validates Jesus' authority and his truthfulness. And so, yes, what else?
Well, maybe he doesn't want things to fall apart with them if they know some things are going to happen and this is the plan all along, then they're not as inclined to, be a domino effect. This one person has done something horrible and, that might kick off some other things, but if they know in advance, they're like, oh, okay, he said this was gonna happen. We understand that this is part of the plan and we need to, consolidate and see it through to the end.
Yeah, okay, there's a couple of things in there let's talk about. Oh, go ahead, share first.
Well, it also says here, I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he.
Okay, cross out he.
No?
Cross out he. This reads in the Greek so that you will believe I am.
Yeah, I am.
Yes, this is the ego in
But I
me.
am.
This is the expression. I mean, the translators add he because it doesn't make a sentence,
Okay,
right?
okay.
You know, it's not grammatically correct in English, but this is a reference. This
So
is one of
and.
John's 7 references to the I am of
So
God.
and should be capitalized.
If I were doing it, that's how I would do it. I am not at the translator level, but you know, take it for what it's worth. Yes, the great I am, exactly. Yes, so that you may believe I am, right? This is literally, you may believe that I am.
Finally, you will believe that I am.
Right, because, okay, so I think two sides to the same coin, like, right? It could all fall apart if you think, like, okay, I don't think it's very probable or believable that the God of the universe is just going to let himself get betrayed by a regular dude, right? He's going to pick him as a disciple and then keep him for 3 years of ministry and then get betrayed by him. That doesn't seem very believable that the God of the universe would do such a thing. And so Jesus has to say, this is exactly what the God of the universe is choosing to do. And you need to know that ahead of time. Yes, it's improbable. It's improbable in the same way that the God of the universe is picking up the apron and doing the dirty job that no one else in the room thought it was their job to do. They're improbable in exactly the same way. God is humble. God humbles himself to do the things that serve humans, a created being. We have an entire set of scripture for the Old Testament. The whole story is of God's pursuit of living and dwelling with mankind, of being in relationship with people who continue to kick him in the teeth over it, right? And he keeps pursuing. What humility! What an amazing, beautiful picture of God. This is glorified. To be glorified is to show the truth of God's nature. And here is God's nature, completely like willing to be betrayed and still give. And that's what we have here.
It also shows how much love he has for us. And that, like, when we talk about why was Judas there? That's because he came for the sinners. He came for all of us, we are all sinners. And Judas is our example of, I love you anyway.
And they all abandoned, and they all, and Peter denied, and Judas betrayed. And I sort of wonder if maybe Judas didn't think that his betrayal was going to go exactly how it went.
Right.
He just needed a little extra cash, and he just thought, what difference can it make? You know, if he's the God of the universe, surely he's got a plan. You know, I don't know what he thought. I do sort of think it probably didn't go the way he expected it to go, because this is the nature of sin. When we get caught up in sin, it never really turns out the way we envisioned. We have a plan like, I'll show them, I'll do this. And yeah, it doesn't go super well. This is the nature of it. So yes, the humility of God. And we remember God the Son has the same character as God the Father and God the Spirit. And none of them can be different in character or nature than the other. So God the Father is just as humble and giving and serving and seeking relationship with people who betray him as God the Son. And that's how it is that the Son of Man is glorified and God is glorified in him. Well, we have our little discipleship teaching all among in here, don't we? Look at verse 20. Verse 16, we talked about a servant is not greater than the master, or a sent one greater than the one who sent him. And then, truly, truly, I say to you, he who receives whomever I send receives me. Who are some people that Jesus sends?
Well, all of us.
Yeah, we have the disciples, the people in the room, and then we just expand through history until we get to all of us, everyone who is from Jesus and goes. And do people always receive Jesus? They do not. His own did not receive him. That's our prologue statement. And so here we will also have that case where people will not always receive us. We will not always be able to escape the betrayal of people around us. And the discipleship pattern exists, that those service actions, we keep pursuing relationship in imitation of our God. We keep serving, we keep giving. And this is showing the full extent of God's love, as our little introduction said. Well, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your thoughtful discussion, your participation. After this scene, Jesus spends many words teaching his disciples. We're not going to do all of them, but we are going to study a section of chapters 14 and 15 next week for Jesus, the true vine. So I hope to see you then.
Thank you so much, Deanna.
Thank you.
And Lee, thank you for snacks this morning.